Okay, today we're going to be talking about the basics of communication. We're going to be really talking down and breaking down how communications works. You'll hear me repeat this throughout the lecture, but remember, communications do not occur in the mind, mouth, or ears or writing of the person who is initiating the communication, but true communication happens on the end of the recipient. So using that as the framework for our discussion today, we're going to talk about how the basics of communication actually work. So what are our key objectives? What we want to do first is to be able to identify some of the key terminology for your consideration. To talk about how we determine what our objectives, styles, and combinations of communication strategies might be. How does credibility play a role in your efficacy as a communicator? How do we know who our audience is? And why is that important? So we can present a message which our audience is ready to receive. How do we also exploit the role of interest and bias in the audience? And also, how do we structure our message for maximum retention and to accomplish the strategy with which we are intending our communication? We also want to talk about direct versus indirect approaches. Also, the bottom line upfront approach. Something we sometimes don't do all that well in academia is get to the point. BLUF stands for bottom line upfront. In a business environment, it makes sense to let your audience know what your intention is as early as possible to be considerate of their time. May I suggest that a similar approach works very well in academia as well. How can we organize our message for the maximum effect? Sometimes we talk about storytelling being a bad thing. I'm here to tell you storytelling is a great thing if done well. So how do we effectively tell stories and use them toward our ends? What about message channels? We have many different ways in which we can communicate directly and indirectly. Can we identify and know what the right channels are? And what about culture? What role does culture play in our communications? In other words, a different environment. Depending on where you're standing or who you're speaking with, messages are flavored and are packaged in specific ways to deal with specific cultural environments. We'll discuss that. So to start off with communicator strategy, we are the communicator. So what kinds of strategy might we be using to get our message across? So to think about it this way, if you as a communicator are starting off, you are the person who is writing, you're the person who is speaking, you're the person who is initiating the message. We have a general objective, and that's the goal, the broad goal which our communication is going. Our action objectives are how we are going to turn the general objective into action, into something that will actually happen. And I refer to those as SMART steps, and of course the term SMART in the world of business, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So that plays here as well. And finally, what is our final result? When we send a message, what is our goal? And I will break this down so we have some specific examples that put this into a context for you. So look at it this way. If we've got a general objective of keeping management aware of new HR initiatives, our action might be to report 2 times each quarter, and that could be in writing or it could be verbally. And our communications goal is to be able to have our boss learn the results of an HR program. So we know generally what we want our communication to accomplish. We know what actions are required, and we hopefully have an intention of what our communications goal will be. What are we doing this for? What is our intended outcome? So, for example, if we're increasing funding for IT services, our action might be to provide weekly status reports of how the system is being used and how staff work orders are being processed. And we're hoping through these communications to secure additional funding. You see where we're going with this. Starting off with a general objective, going into actions, and going with communications objectives. So if you know what your general objective is, you can turn that into action to satisfy what your ultimate communications goals are. So let's talk a little bit more about what style to use. We've got 2 general approaches. We've got a tell, sell, or a consult, join type approach. If you're telling and selling, You've got control of your content. If you're consulting and joining, you're asking for audience involvement. Let's think about where we would use these approaches, and we'll talk significantly about this. Tell, sell is to inform. Consult, join is to get information, to assist. Tell, sell might be persuading, but so might consult and join. It depends on the nature of your audience and how much input you ultimately need from them. But ultimately, if you're telling and selling, you've got control of the content. If you're doing a podcast, you've got control of the content. If you're doing a focus group, a consult and join, the audience themselves has a large stake in how the content gets processed. So, tell, sell, we want the audience to learn from us. If we're telling them, we are explaining something that we already know. If we're selling them, we're trying to get them on board with us. You do this kind of approach if you've got as much information as you need and don't require additional input. You're controlling the message. In a consult-join situation, a consult might be asking for information. Join means possibly a brainstorming session. You're trying to get somebody on your side. You need additional information. You need to be able to glean something from the audience you're discussing. You are more beholden to the audience in this regard. So you might combine styles. For example, if you are using a join approach, you might want to brainstorm ideas. Consult, you're trying to pick between several ideas. If you're selling, you're trying to convince somebody to do something. If you're telling someone, for example, if a policy has already been decided upon, you are rolling it out and letting people know this is the way it is. So again, you can think of many situations you would use these types of approaches. Generally speaking, in an academic presentation, you would probably be doing a tell or sell type of approach as opposed to consult and join. So let's talk about communications objectives versus the style you would use. For example, if your communications objective is to be able to have people know what their benefit options are, that's obviously a tell approach. If you are trying to get people to give input on the types of benefits you would offer, you might use a consult style, and so on and so forth. Our text, although it is small and to the point, gives some great examples of when you would use all of these types of approaches. So let's talk about the role of credibility. When we get into being credible, what makes somebody credible? Think about this in your own academic or professional lives. Just your rank can make you credible. If somebody says, I'm the CEO or I'm the CFO, that title carries gravity. But so does goodwill. People who are well-liked, even if they are not necessarily credible from an academic or a credentialed standpoint, tend to carry credibility because people like them. People who are regarded as experts, you might not like them at all, but you might give them lots of credibility if you know that Sam down in accounting knows what he's talking about, even if he's not that much fun to be around. He carries credit. Image. Yes, image carries weight. Think about this. Somebody who walks into a room with a black pinstripe suit and slick back hair and expensive shoes is conveying that there's a reason they look that way. They were able to buy these things and to look that way because they have earned a level of expertise, a level of credibility, and also common ground. People who can talk the talk. For example, outside of St. Francis, I'm a musician. If I'm able to come into a room full of fellow musicians and talk about gigs we've played on similar stages, our common ground gives us credibility. Your initial credibility is what you carry with you when you walk in the room or first send that message. You hopefully will have a bank of credibility from which to draw. So think about something, guys. There's an old expression that goes, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. And that's been paraphrased many different ways. It means that before you start, before you say a word or type a word, you are starting off with at least, hopefully, a neutral amount of credibility. You acquire your credibility through more communications and positive expressions, and ultimately associating with people who are of high caliber, who are given credibility on their own doesn't hurt your credibility either. So let's talk about this. I mean, this is a great cross-section right from our text that explains some of the things we just talked about. Now, I would like to digress for a moment that rank might get you through the door. A nice-looking suit might get you through the door, or somebody liking you as a person might get you through the door, but that initial credibility needs to be backed up. So whether it's image, common ground, expertise, whatever you're bringing with you, you cannot rest on your laurels. Your communications need to back up what you are presenting. So we talked about some of the key terms early on in the presentation. Let's get into audience strategy. We talked about communicator strategy and how we establish credibility. Let's talk about how we work with our audience. I mentioned this earlier on. I should have attributed this to Peter Drucker, obviously one of our biggest management gurus. But I'm going to read this verbatim because I want you to remember it. Communication takes place in the mind of the listener, not in the speaker. So it's not what you said, it's what they hear. It's not what you write, it's what they read. I can't tell you the number of people who have had troubles in their communications because what they believed they were saying is not what the audience ultimately heard. And the different types of communicator strategies we're talking about will change the way that audiences react to us. That's why we're having this conversation. So the first thing to think about is who is ultimately your audience. Who are the people who are getting the message directly? Who are you sending that email to? Who are you presenting to? Is there an unknown audience that you're presenting to? In other words, what do you know about them? What do you know about their beliefs? What do you know about their preferences? If you have a familiar audience, it still means if you're presenting to people who you regularly present to and you feel like you know them like the back of your hand, it still means we should take time to try to figure out exactly who we are presenting to. So again, the primary audience are the people who get the message, who are intended to receive it. We've also got, within our audience, we've got decision makers, opinion leaders, and gatekeepers. And here's what I mean by that. The person sitting at the head of the table, ultimately who's making the decision, may rely on people sitting next to them, opinion leaders, to give them additional input, and do not underestimate the power of people who can control communications. We call these people gatekeepers. If you are dealing with a very highly powerful CEO, that person may not speak to you without going through their administrative assistant or office manager first, who may receive their personal correspondence, may even receive their emails before that person ultimately, before the power broker ultimately gets the communication. So make sure that you know that the gatekeepers may be people you need to consider in your communications as well. Who are your secondary audiences? If they're in a carbon field, they're a secondary audience. Sometimes secondary audiences means if you need to run your communications through somebody before you send them out, that would be a secondary audience. Or people who, even if they aren't in the initial communication, could say negative things about your communication later. Who's in that CC field in the email ultimately matters an awful lot. So your audience, what are they expecting? What do they already know? If you're dealing with a professional group, are they expecting that you will be conversant with their lingo? Or are they expecting you to be able to use acronyms? What kind of background do they have already on what you're talking to them about? Jargon is a very controversial subject regardless of discipline. In terms of jargon, how much should you use? On one hand, using jargon can establish credibility that shows you're familiar with a particular discipline. On the other hand, it can be very alienating if you're talking to people who are unfamiliar. Nobody wants to look stupid. I would say the ultimate fallback, if you're unsure, is use the old acronym KISS. Keep it simple, stupid, because nobody wants to look stupid. In other words, don't use jargon, use terminology anybody can understand. Providing background info is always a good thing. If you're talking about a new project, for example, in an academic standpoint, If you're giving me a presentation on a current trend in human resource management, as your instructor, it is perfectly reasonable to think I should be conversant with new trends. That being said, it's never a bad thing to provide background information. It's always a good thing to acknowledge where you got your information, whether you're in an academic setting or not. Focus your message. Make sure you're getting your points across, but be inclusive. Don't cut people out. The more you give backgrounds, the more you explain acronyms, the more you are inclusive with your message, the safer you will probably be. So what about format expectations? What about timing? In terms of the timing of a message, is your audience expecting to be able to hear from you the day after you've made a presentation? Are they expecting to get a visually stunning presentation, or are they expecting bullet points on a screen? How formal is your audience? For example, if you're presenting to an academic audience between one class and the next, the level of expected formality could be vastly different, which is same in a professional setting. I advise to use humor and sarcasm very cautiously. In a live environment, we can offer context. We can use facial expressions. We can use inflections. Writing is a very difficult medium to convey these concepts, particularly electronic communications. Think in your own personal lives the number of times you have misconstrued a text message or an email based on brevity. Your audience strategy is also going to be based on the feelings surrounding the message. For example, if you are conveying information that is not positive, if you're talking about layoffs, we're talking about reductions in healthcare or benefits, humor and sarcasm are not going to go far for you. Think about that. How is the message going to make them feel? How interested in people and what you have to say? If the level of interest is low, you probably want to get to the point very quickly. And additionally, if interest is high and stressful, you also want to get to the point quickly as well. So if the interest level is high, if people are dying to know what's happening with the layoffs, get to the point. Don't keep them in suspense. If the interest level is low, you may actually want to chime in and get people interested, show them what's in it for them. If you've got a positive or neutral bias, make sure to reinforce the positive or existing attitude, at least if it's negative, or if it's positive or neutral rather. If you have a negative bias, show them what the problem is and solve it. Explain why this is important to them. Start off by giving them points they agree with and chumming them in. I'll give you a great example. Regardless of which political party is in power, there are things that a sitting president will do that will please members of the opposition. If you're trying to get the opposition to listen to you, explain where the common ground is first. Use the foot in the door approach. If you have such a hostile audience, you need to get them to agree to something. Agree that healthcare is important to everybody before you start talking about the cuts. And respond to any objections. If you know people are going to say terrible things or be unexcited about what you have to sell, acknowledge up front the elephant in the room. And there it is, folks, the elephant in the room, which these two speakers have felt compelled not to recognize. I encourage you to recognize the elephant in the room. So how difficult is the desired action? If you're asking people to do something that's very easy, just show them how it's in their benefit. If what you're asking somebody to do in a consult and join way of being is very difficult, make the action as easy as you possibly can and break it down as far as you can. You may have to think about what's actually going to work, what's going to ultimately persuade someone, what would make them make a positive decision. You may need to think about how they could benefit. In other words, what is it that you're trying to present that ultimately would benefit them? Are there ways you can draw on your own credibility, for example, and how can you structure the message to effectively get the point across? I would think an approach would be, if you've got a hostile audience that you've got to try to persuade to go your way, you could emphasize, number one, signing up for this benefits program will give you some level of health care, your own credibility. I worked for the same company as you. I'm in the same boat as you. It's not fun, but it's our best option. Structuring our message delivery, I would state up front, look, this isn't an ideal situation. These are our financials. This is what we can afford. I'm in this with you. This is what we're up against. So again, you need to think about your bottom line with people in this regard. If you remember one thing from this lecture outside of the fact that communication takes place in the mind of the recipient, remember this acronym, WIIFT, what's in it for them. Anytime you're able to show somebody how something will benefit them, you have a better chance they're willing to listen to you. So we could be talking about money to be made. We could be talking about boost to the career or the ego. If you've got people who love information, if they love data, if they love information, you might be able to stroke their egos by presenting to them what it is that appeals to them the most. For example, people who love numbers may want to see the numbers. That might be how you show them benefit. People who love to be engaged, who love energy of presenters, being enthusiastic may engage them. Showing the audience how this is a good project for everyone may be a good approach as well to show what's in it for them. A consistency benefit means, can you get other people in the audience to say why they have supported this? Can you build additional support from people who are sitting in your audience? So in terms of how we establish credibility, again, do we have common ground and shared values? We're on the same team here. I work with you. Goodwill or credibility or reciprocity, meaning that if you help me out with this, I'm going to give you support back. What about connecting with the audience's feelings? What about explaining how having health care has helped your family, how it's been important to you? You can even say that basically based on your rank or credibility, either I'm the boss and you're going to do it because I'm the boss, or because I've got a proven track record of not making mistakes, that's why you should support my proposal. I caution you with using this approach, the rank, credibility, or punishment, meaning that basically if you don't do this, there will be consequences, and because of who I am, you'll have to do what I say. Whether it's in an academic setting where an instructor is saying you're going to do this because I'm your instructor, or in a business setting you're going to do this because I'm the boss, that'll work once in a while. You can definitely pull rank once in a while, but does it build credibility that's going to be sustainable? Not in the long run. That's not this instructor's opinion anyway. Okay, in terms of message structure, we talked about bluff, bottom line up front. In the opening and closing of your message, whether it's in writing or whether it's in person, I would emphasize the benefits of supporting your solution if you're doing a telesell, for example. You could also start off by presenting what the problem is and providing a solution to that problem. One-sided versus two-sided structure. That means if you've got a big or controversial subject, you may want to present the pros and the cons. And that means that you are presenting both sides of the argument. That way you're addressing the opposition as well. People are more likely to listen to you in a live setting or read your points if you're willing to address their concerns and acknowledge that they are real problems up front. And they're more likely to see you as reasonable and fair. It's just human nature. Well, what about the pro-con versus con-pro? If you've got a non-controversial subject, start off with the pros and then deal with the cons. If you've got a very controversial subject that you're likely to encompass or receive opposition to, you may want to start off with the cons first. Address the elephant in the room. Address it up front. So again, it's based on the situation you're dealing with. So we have a couple other approaches to think about. You can use what they refer to as the inoculation technique, and it's called this because I don't know if you know how vaccines work, but use a reduced or dormant version of a virus to build inoculation within an individual so they can build antibodies. Well, we do the same thing. We can start off with a mild opposing view of the situation and build in. So in other words, we're starting off with a negative or opposing view. I'll give you an example. Well, maybe we would be better eliminating healthcare. And start off with that view and build into why that's not a good idea and why accepting the proposal that is available might be a better approach for everyone. So we can inoculate. You can use ascending versus descending order. If you've got a very informed audience who is already well informed on what you're talking about, start off with the strongest pro and con arguments and work your way to the lesser arguments. If you've got a less informed audience, or maybe you have less credibility, start off with the less important arguments and work your way into the big ones. Again, the ask for less, the foot in the door, start off with the smallest possible request. Guys, will you at least be willing to hear me out? Will you at least be willing to go $5 higher on your copay before we get to the cost of deductibles? Or you could ask for more. You could make the biggest ask first, assuming failure, and then work your way down. It's a bargaining technique, for example. If you are trying to buy a car, you're going to make a low-ball offer first that you know they aren't accepting to get back to where you ultimately want to be. Well, since we've talked about our communicator strategy and our audience strategy, let's get down to our message strategy. This is where the action begins to happen in terms of how we get out the message we're actually trying to convey. Let's kind of talk pedagogy here. In terms of a message strategy, let's think about how this actually works. When you are preparing a message, you as the communicator start off with entropy. You start off with all this information, bad ideas, good ideas, data, all these things that you're processing, and ultimately you reach your conclusion. We think about things, we process the information, and we reach a conclusion. The strategic approach to delivering that conclusion needs to work in an opposite way, where we think to come up with an answer, where we think to come up with a conclusion. We start with the conclusion with our audience and justify it. This is what is known as the bottom line upfront approach. And 9 times out of 10, it works really well. Do we want to use this in a movie? No. You want to wait to the end and be held in suspense. Nobody wants a spoiler. Conversely, if you're reading a research report or if you're reading a market analysis, it's good to have a summary up front so you know what the results are. If all I get to do as CEO is read the first and last page of your document, I should be able to know what it means. Now, I have reasons that I would want to know how it came to be, but I should still know the results. And that's the idea of organized ideas being stated first. Bottom line up front. So I encourage you to think about how to harness beginnings and endings. Let's think about this. What is happening in this diagram? It is the dreaded dip in the middle. What do we always remember from a movie? We always remember the beginning and the ending. If you're a Star Wars fan like me, you remember the beginning of the first Star Wars film. The episode 4 from 1977 starts off with Princess Leia running from the Empire. And the end of the movie is Luke Skywalker triumphantly destroying the Death Star. We always remember those things. The dip in the middle is tough. That being said, if we know we will lose the audience somewhat, no matter what we do in that document or presentation, we had better harness the power of beginnings and endings to our advantage. So my advice to you, don't hide the important points in the middle. There are reasons that sometimes in corporate reports that bad information is not mentioned up front or in the back. Things that people don't want to talk about are stuck in the middle, hoping nobody will read it. You want to state your conclusions up front and at the end of the document. Again, bottom line up front, the direct approach, bluff. That is the third thing I want you to remember from this presentation. If you're using an indirect approach, which unfortunately is often very popular in academic circles, it takes a lot more time for the audience, and it takes a lot more time for people to glean information, useful information, from your document or from your presentation. So, bottom line up front is an approach I recommend using as often as possible. Who doesn't like to have their time well used? Business audiences particularly like it because if I am sitting in a presentation for 2 hours wondering if my benefits are being cut and I have to wait until the end, how much am I really hearing from the rest of the presentation? why not say up front what the reason is? Are there reasons to be indirect? Well, if you've got an extremely sensitive topic or hostile audience, yeah, you might need to be indirect. If you've got somebody who is very analysis-oriented and needs to be built up to a conclusion, yeah, you might need to be indirect. And if you're in a cultural situation where indirect is the letter of the law per se, yeah, you might need to be indirect. Some, for example, Eastern audiences prefer a more indirect approach, and one that is more time-consuming than stating up front what the conclusions are, as we often do in Western business. How can we fight that retention dip in the middle? Break it into chunks. Stop at certain points. You see the little wave we have here in terms of the dips in retention. Why not use those dip points as places to recap? There are reasons why I repeat things through presentations. In addition to my encroaching senility, I repeat things in the hopes that you will retain them. And it creates what we refer to as mini memory curves. So what are some other strategies? Again, repetition. I think I'm repeating the fact that I'm repeating. How can we flag stuff? Well, you can flag things by coloring them differently, by labeling them differently. The unexpected means, for example, if I had a random animation jumping out with a Chinese dragon to coincide with the unexpected, that would be very unexpected. Or if I decided to sing a Michael McDonald tune in the middle of this presentation, which much to my wife's chagrin, would not work out well for anybody. My wife is much less complimentary on my singing voice. And and visuals. Visuals also help draw in points. Think about this. If we use visuals or diagrams, I would imagine nobody will soon forget the elephant in the middle of the room slide, because that image sticks with us. So, in terms of organizing our message, for our tell approach, sequential points that build up to a point so it's mathematical makes sense. You can use key questions. If we are answering questions about why we need to take a particular approach, if we're selling, we can use steps in a process, or we can provide alternatives to build a point for what we are ultimately selling. Well, you could go with benefits package A, but you would lose the following things. You could go with benefits package B, you would gain the following things but lose these amazing benefits, which is why we are saying you should go with benefit package C. In terms of the persuasive approach, a list of recommendations, what we need to do or change is helpful. A list of how these changes are going to benefit us. You can also use an indirect approach of problems and possible solutions as well. Again, great recommendations right from our text. Stories are great ways to connect, but I would express to you to use them with caution. By the way, the illustration on the right is a cave painting, indicative of the fact that humans have been visual communicators since there have been human beings. So it's anybody who knows me in a personal context knows my affection for graphic art and comic books. They are core to who we are, and the irony being that from the time we could create any kind of communication, we were using it to tell stories. So why do we tell stories? Well, we tell stories to have parables, to make abstract concepts applied to people. We remember stories, too. It makes material more sticky, as we say. It brings in the audience emotionally. If we're able to make a reference to a story that we care about, that people, for example, I make lots of Star Wars references because people have an emotional connection with Star Wars. It helps us bridge relationships with people. If we're telling stories about the old days in the company and people have a sense of nostalgia about the way things used to be, that helps us well. Helps us build credibility, that we know what we're talking about and we can apply it within our own context. And also can build spirit. It's just a great way to convey information. So what are some concerns? Well, telling stories is something that has to be told at the right time. In the period of crisis in a company, yes, telling a story, an inspiring story, might be exactly the right time. At a time in the middle of layoffs, a humorous anecdote might not be the right time. The story needs to have a point as well. Not everybody's a great storyteller, which means you have to make sure that there is a point that is relevant to the point you're trying to make. For example, as much as I love to make Star Wars references, making a reference about blowing up the Death Star and comparing it to having a successful semester may not be a direct analogy for a lot of people in this class. Classic themes, good versus evil, the idea of overcoming obstacles, those are great classic themes. If you get too abstract with it, it doesn't stick with the audience. And also, if you're using stories and you're just dragging out a presentation or a document, I caution you with using stories and documents again because of context, particularly if you're using humor. And also, are you in step or out of step with your audience? I'm taking a risk by referencing the old Star Wars films from the 70s and 80s and hoping that my audience has seen those films because I'm a person of a certain age. And yes, I may have cultural references that are very relevant to me, maybe not so much to other people in my audience. So what are some of the elements of a good story? Bottom line, there has to be an incident. There has to be a reason, a challenge, a reason why we're telling the story. Who's the good guy, the protagonist? What are they overcoming and what is the risk of what they're trying to overcome? Is there a decision point? We're talking about the classic hero's quest kind of stuff here. What is the ultimate result? The Boy Who Cried Wolf, for example, is an old classic story. What happened when he cried wolf? Eventually no help came. And so that was the result. And the more you can give vivid, expressive details, the more your audience will probably enjoy it. Let me give you great examples. Okay, again, I'm taking a risk here and hoping that you've all seen the Star Wars films. The first Star Wars movie, 1977, fantastic. You can describe the plot of this movie in 30 seconds. A small-town boy takes on the biggest evil in the universe and conquers it, bringing light to the galaxy. Try explaining any of the prequels, which were muddled, messy films, in less than 30 seconds, and you won't even begin to touch the muddled complexity that is those films. In fact, I defy you to even tell me who the main character is in Episode 1. For any of my audience who are alienating through my Star Wars references, or if there is a member of George Lucas's family that is listening, I apologize in advance. So, I think the evidence to this being a good story is the fact that the first Star Wars movie came out in 1977. 40 years in 2017 since the first Star Wars film. And if you make the reference of somebody being like Darth Vader, even if they don't like Star Wars or science fiction, they will know what you mean. So let's move on to channel choice strategy. How do we know what is the right way to reach someone? So our channel of communications is the old expression from Marshall McLuhan, the media is the message, meaning the way we communicate. The tools with which we use to communicate say a lot. So the channel is the medium. So it's the pipe which ships our message. For example, if our medium is email versus in-person presentation versus a long-form document or a term paper, those are all different kinds of mediums. So what are our concerns? What are things we should be thinking about? Well, what's your audience want? What are they expecting? What's their preference? How much interaction is required? If we're talking about a consult join approach, for example, a paper, a term paper type approach, or a large document might not be the right way to go. If you need to have subtleties of nonverbal communications, yes, you may need to do an in-person presentation. How much do you need to control the timing of your message? You can definitely control when emails are sent, when documents are shared. Conversely, do you want a permanent record of this conversation? If you put it on email, if you put it in digital writing and transmit it, it's there in perpetuity. So consider that. How much detail needs to be communicated, and what are the risks of the method that you're using? So when you want a permanent record, these are times when you should really consider writing it down. When you want a permanent record, if this is something people need to make reference to and to repeatedly read, when you have to be very specific in what you're talking about, these are all great reasons to write. If you're trying to save your audience time, yes, you may want to send them out a read ahead. Even if you're doing an in-person presentation later, it's ultimately going to save time. If you need feedback in a presentation, if you're doing a consult join, giving somebody material to read ahead of time may ultimately be considerate to them. And if you have a public audience, obviously writing it down means it can be shared on a website or a blog. If you need more immediate feedback, if you want everybody to get the message at the same time so you can control when they're receiving it, even though we can send an email to everybody all at once, there's no guarantee they're all going to open it at the same time. And if we're talking about a plant closing or people losing benefits or something that's not good news, having people in person may make a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. Or if you're trying to build community, you're trying to get some sort of group interaction going, again, it might be better to present. Okay, we're getting into a little bit of management philosophy here, but when would you want to speak with an individual as opposed to a group? Well, if you've got information that's going to be sensitive to talk in a public setting or a group setting about, where you're trying to build an individual relationship, or if you're looking for individual feedback from one person, obviously it makes sense to just speak with that person. We can combine channels. Like I said before, read-aheads are always a great idea. In-person follow-ups to written communications, or conversely, written follow-ups to verbal communications. I am a big fan of these, meaning that once you've had a conversation with somebody, I generally think it's a great idea to follow up in writing to confirm that what you said was actually what they heard. And it's the more communications you can get, the more confirmation you can get, generally speaking, the better. You may also, if you're having a large group meeting that you're looking for feedback, a small group follow-up may get you more useful feedback for people who felt intimidated to speak in a large group. So here's a great summary, again, right from our text in terms of when to use written versus oral versus blended styles of communications. Again, right from our text, very useful. I encourage you to reference it. So that gets us to our last subject, namely culture strategies, other extenuating items that we need to think about when communicating. So no matter where you are in the world, every country or county or region has its own method of communicating. We have our own cultures. We have what we value. I'll give you a great example. And if you're from New York, you value directness. If you're from our portion of Pennsylvania, you value humility. You value people being honest. Every culture has its own way of communicating, and that affects the ways we communicate verbally and in writing, something to consider. So, what are the things we want to think about? What's the culture? If you're in an academic setting, for example, it may be relatively laid back in terms of things like schedule, but in terms of decorum may be very formal. You would defer to people with titles or ranks. A tech startup, for example, may be very informal. What about fate? I know this is a strange concept, but deterministic. Are you presenting to a culture that believes in free will or empowerment or not? What about communication style? Are we in a very collective kind of approach versus an individualistic or autocratic approach? In other words, if you are in a culture where instructors or CEOs are not challenged, you're going to be presenting to the head of the room and not in a collaborative type setting. Not everybody in the room will carry the same amount of weight in the conversation. For example, not everybody on the email list may have a say in the document. Well, what gives you credibility in a given culture? Some folks very much value goodwill and politeness, where others could care less if somebody's nice or not, but what kind of expertise they have. Some cultures value age and wisdom versus people who value youth and innovation. I would argue that the United States is in a bit of flux right now, that we are valuing youthful innovation more than age and wisdom used to be. I'm not saying they're still not valued, but we're definitely in a transitional period. Some countries have very tight social strata, meaning that if you are a member of a specific caste, you will be spoken to differently. And again, depending on the culture, different people may be welcome in the room or not. There are patriarchal cultures still in 2017 and beyond that basically do not allow females in the room for managerial decisions. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm saying that it's something you need to be aware of in your cultural communications. So, what persuades one culture may not persuade another. In other words, charm and flash may have very little value to somebody who is more based on analytics and more based on time to build relationships. Again, in terms of gender-based tendencies, we still have patriarchal cultures, and people of different genders may be expected to act differently in meetings. If you are presenting to a Japanese audience, they may want a long presentation with a strong amount of build to give an opportunity to build trust. So as opposed to a Western Wall Street audience, which wants you to get to the point and let them know what's in it for them. Depending on what channel that we're using, if you're presenting to engineers, they probably would love a large binder of statistics and mathematical information versus the executives who would love a one-page summary emailed to their smartphones. What about nonverbal behavior? Eye contact is generally considered to be trustworthy in the United States, not so much in other cultures. Other cultures also have different views toward space, including personal space, and how much you should be in somebody else's area, for example. This is just a personal theory, and I really think that one of the reasons we have different degrees of personal space has to do a lot with the country itself. We're in a very large country, and people who have more space on a general basis, whether it's the amount of property you own, the population density, etc., are less comfortable with close communications because we're used to giving each other more space. So I think that has something to do with the fact that Europeans, for example, tend to be closer talkers than North Americans because of the amount of population density that we have. And finally, depending on where you're going, if you are being greeted in certain areas of the world, you might end up getting kissed on the cheek when you show up. Know your culture before you show up. Folks, I want to thank you very much for this the attention during this introduction to communication strategy, and I'm looking forward to our next time together online. Take care.